This lecture is on Anselm's ontological arguments. There are actually two of them, and this first video will be on the first argument, just presenting it, and then we'll get into objections and so on. If Anselm is right, then atheists are all wet. He basically claims that he can prove there's a perfect being, and if there is a perfect being, then it seems that atheism is false. But who was Anselm? This is actually a little image from the margins of a medieval manuscript of him. It's probably not exactly contemporary with him, but anyway, it's fun. Anselm, his years were 1033 to 1109, and he was a lifelong Benedictine monk. He was actually an Italian from Italy. For the last part of his career, for the last 16 years of his life, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury in England. This means that he was the chief Roman Catholic bishop in all of Great Britain. And in that capacity, spent a lot of time and energy asserting the rights of the Pope over two different kings. This was always an issue back then, the struggle for power between the papacy and the secular rulers. Anselm is most famous for a couple of works. The first is called his Monologion, and this work, written in 1076, this work features a couple of different arguments for the existence of God. But honestly, they're kind of long and convoluted, and we're not going to go into them. Anselm realized that these arguments were difficult to follow and not, if an argument is so difficult that you can barely follow it, it's just less persuasive. You're not really sure whether you should say it's cogent or not. After this, Anselm tells us he prayed to God that he would find a simpler proof of God's existence. And in his next book, the Proslogion, written somewhere around 1077, 1078, he thinks that he found this argument. A simple, pretty easy to understand proof of the existence of God. So that's what we're going to look at right now. Well, we're going to look at one of the two that philosophers have found in the Proslogion. Anselm is a likable character for the most part. He's smart, he's disciplined, he writes simply and pretty persuasively. He's a pretty good philosopher. The philosophy in Anselm is always in service of defending his Catholic faith. He was canonized as an official saint of the Roman Catholic Church in the year 1494, so he's been pretty well regarded since. So let's take a look at his main ontological argument presented in Chapter 2 of his Proslogion. First, he quotes a passage from the Psalms in the Bible, which says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." So I have here pictures of some, call them the four horsemen of the new atheism. He does think that atheism is foolish in the sense that theism or monotheism can be proven. So here's his argument. The first premise says that God is by definition the greatest conceivable being. And we'll write out to the to the right hand of each step in this argument with the justification for it. This, of course, is an independent premise. Whenever we see an independent premise, we should ask ourselves what the justification for it is. Why should we think that that's true? So the greatest conceivable being just means a being than which a greater cannot be thought. The greatest sort of thing that you can think of. What's the justification for this premise? Well, the important part is probably this right here. He's defining how he's using the word God. Okay, well, he can use the word God however he wants. So it doesn't seem to be to the point to object that this is false. He's saying by God, I mean the greatest thing that can possibly be thought of. The greatest conceivable being. Don't make the mistake of thinking that this assumes the existence of God. It doesn't assume this first premise, God's existence. Right? It's just a definition. Now we're going to go on, Anselm is, to argue that there really is a being like this. The atheist should not disagree with the definition of God, nor should the agnostic or anybody else. If one has a different concept of God, or if one wants to use the word God differently, one can do that, but then that's not clearly relevant to this argument. Second premise. It is greater for a thing to exist in someone's mind and in reality than only in someone's mind. It's greater for a thing to exist in someone's mind and in reality than for it to exist only in someone's mind. This, too, is an independent premise, and we will come back and consider some objections to this shortly. But the basic idea is there are certain features because of which you are great, or because of which anything that is great is great. Call them great-making features or great-making properties. And among those great-making properties would be things like intelligence, beauty, goodness, power. And one of those great-making properties is existence. And if something exists only in someone's mind versus also existing in reality, it'd be a little bit greater if everything else was the same and it also existed in reality. Third step of the argument says either God exists in my mind but not in reality, or he exists in both. Now that too is an independent premise. And it's not obviously true, right? Because these aren't all the options. Either God exists in my mind but not in reality, or he exists in both. There are other options, aren't there? So let's consider them like this. Let's just make 4 spaces, because there's really 4 options. Either God exists in mind alone, in other words, he's imaginary, or God exists in reality alone, or God exists in mind and in reality, or neither mind nor reality, right? So he could exist in one way or the other way, could exist in both ways or in neither way, right? Those are all the options. Okay, but I'm giving you the justification for premise 3 here. Anselm's idea is that whenever someone thinks about a thing, then it exists in his or her mind. Okay, both the atheist and the monotheist are thinking about God. So therefore, God does not exist in reality alone, must also exist in the mind of thinkers, and for the same reason he can't exist in neither. So consequently, there really are those 2 options. Right, and these are the 2 options, mind and reality. That's that one. And then mind alone. These are the 2 options that the argument says. Okay, so the reason why there are only 2 options in... whoops, I used the wrong premise there. Sorry. We just explained why there are only 2 options here. Only in mind or existing in both. Because again, the atheist and the monotheist are both thinking of God. Okay, so we have 3 independent premises there. Each one seems reasonable enough at first glance. And then this is all the argument needs to get going. So let's look at how the argument flows logically from here, just from these 3 premises. Step 4 says, suppose that God exists in my mind, but not in reality. Okay, so there are 2 options here. And this line doesn't need a justification. We're just supposing for the sake of argument that one of those options is the case. Namely this first one here, right? In my mind, but not in reality. So The third step says either this or that. Let's consider the first option, that God exists in my mind, but not in reality. Step 5, therefore, God is not the greatest conceivable being. That follows from 2 and 4. If God exists in mind, but not in reality, yet it is greater for a thing to exist in someone's mind and in reality than only in the mind, then it would follow that God, from just 2 and 4, it follows that God is not the greatest conceivable being. Okay, but this is impossible. This is contradictory to what's already been said, right? From 1, we know that God is by definition the greatest conceivable being. Now, he can't be the greatest conceivable being and also not be the greatest conceivable being. So what we're saying is there's 2 options. Either God exists in mind but not in reality, or God exists in both mind and in reality. And the way the argument works is basically this first option is contradictory. If we suppose it to be true, we can logically derive a contradiction. So it must be this other one. There's only 2 options and the first one's contradictory. It must be the other option. Therefore, God exists both in my mind and in reality. That follows from 4 through 6. That's where we considered the one option. And then from 3, which says there's only 2 options. Therefore, God exists. And which step does this follow from? Well, if God exists in reality, then God just plain exists, right? Exists in your mind, you're thinking about him, but he's also in reality, is what step 7 says. So 8 follows from 7. Now what are we to say about this argument? It looks like it's valid. Its validity has been challenged, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it looks like it's valid. But there's something strange about this argument. Some people react by saying, surely this is a joke. There's something, you're not being serious here, right? You've just started out with the concept of something, the fact that something can be thought about, and you've argued on that basis that it really is there. Isn't this sophistry? Right? Sophistry is bad argumentation, giving invalid or valid but unsound arguments. There's also an idea that the sophist is not serious. They're just jerking us around. On the other hand, a number of great philosophers have thought these kind of arguments are sound, including people like the great philosopher Descartes, who we're familiar with. Also Leibniz in the early modern era, and, well, lots of others. There are philosophers today who think that this sort of argument is sound, or some version of the ontological argument is sound. So in the next segment, we'll take a look at some objections and replies, and we'll try to render a verdict on this first form of the ontological argument.